we're looking at the settings for Excel and in fact Office in general, and we've looked at the general settings and the proofing options, and now I want to progress to the next stage. So let's get back into Excel and have a look at what the settings present us. So here we are in an Excel spreadsheet, a workbook, and we're looking once again at the options. So let's do our usual trick, go up here into options. Now we've looked at general and we've worked through that. We've avoided formulas or formulae, and we've looked at proofing. So we're now going to look at save. This is a little bit kind of more mainstream and a little bit easier to work through. So the first thing is, the first option here is save files in this format, and the default is always XLSX. The only real reason you're likely to change this, to be honest, is either if you still do a lot of work in the old format Excel, so you might want to change it to simple XLS rather than XLSX, or if you also use some other Office suite by which you can do spreadsheets and they save spreadsheets in one of these other formats. Now some of these may be useful temporarily, but you do get the option when you save an Excel spreadsheet to save it in a particular format anyway. So things like CSV is a good example. You can automatically save in CSV here by changing it, but it means you're saving it in CSV every time, and there are options in the normal save for you to change it, or in fact in export facilities. So I would suggest that for the vast majority of people you would never change the format. It has to be a specific reason why you would want to change it. Set auto recovery information is the next one. Now you can simply disable this by unchecking that check. I would like to suggest that's a bad idea. If you have a very old and very slow computer system where the autosave process kind of makes you hang whenever it kicks in, then you may find that you have to disable it just simply to stop that from happening. But even there, I would suggest rather than disabling it, you simply increase the number of minutes, so you only autosave infrequently. I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, it actually tells you the maximum value you can have is 120 minutes. So you could actually set it to only autosave once every 2 hours. And I would suggest that it's worth the pain for you to have an occasional autosave. I would say even deferring for 2 hours is a little bit dangerous, because if something happens, if your computer crashes or something happens, you meet something very unusual and the Excel itself just dies, you could have lost a significant piece of work. So change this with care. But if you do have very old, very poor performing systems, then yeah, you might have to do that. You also have the option to keep the last auto-recovered version when you close. It's when it closes without saving. And these two kind of go together. I don't know if it's happened to you, but sometimes some problem occurs and it just dies. And then next time you log in, you actually get a flash on the left and it tells you that there's an unsaved copy. Well, that's what this is about. It's kept one of the auto-recovered copies, the last one. And again, I would say disable that with reluctance. Obviously, if you've disabled auto-recover completely, then that option doesn't exist. Obviously, if you've changed the time to say 120 minutes and you've only been working for 90 minutes when the thing crashes, then again, there will be nothing to recover, which is why the 10 minutes type frequency is useful. But it saved my bacon a few times. So I would say be reluctant to change either of these options, but there may be situations where it will work. We then in fact come to the auto recover file location. So this is where will it actually save these files to. Now there's several different parts of these options where you can define locations. The default local file location is quite an important one, and we'll talk about that in more detail when we come to it. And then in fact there's templates, which for most people is probably less important. But I need to kind of do a little aside on this. So apologies that I'm kind of, well, as I say, doing an aside. But let's look at a typical PC. Now this PC that I'm using at the moment is actually not typical. But what I want to show you are these disks or these drives. It says devices and drives. Now if you're using a laptop and you look, this is in fact in Windows Explorer, and I'm looking at this PC and it gives me a little bit of a summary. These things at the top are really the kind of standard default folders where you can find things like the stuff you've downloaded, music, pictures. By default, they will be the places where things are put. So don't worry about those. Those are actually all on the C drive, and they're probably in your user area. So, and if you have several people using your PC, although they will have the same objects, they will be in different locations. But don't worry about that. If you have a PC, you will probably, or almost certainly, be working from the C drive. So I'm going to refer to the C drive as your default drive. There are a small number of implementations where it's some other letter, but normally it will be the C drive. Most laptops in this day and age will also have a D drive, but it won't be called new volume. It will be something like recovery disk or something like that. You may even have a third drive. And if you look at the size of those disks, I mean, this size, this is my main starting disk, and you can see it says there's 81 gigabytes free of 231 gigabytes. So my system disk, which is what we call this, the disk that it actually loads from, all the stuff is sitting in, is just under 250 gigabytes in size, which would be pretty much the smallest disk you'd like to have. You may have, if you're working from a laptop, it may only be 120, 128 gig or something like that. But in a lot of machines, it will be a lot bigger than 231 gig. Now, if you look at the D drive, if it's only 12 gigabytes, say, a relatively small size or less, then that's another indicator that it's actually one of these recovery disks recovery drives, sorry. And in fact, if you've got another one that's even smaller, some of them are less than a gigabyte. Now, what that's telling you is that these are specialized drives. You will not use them yourself. You shouldn't access them. They are there, the recovery drive in particular, is there so that you can simply reinstall everything on your laptop and it will all come back as fresh. It's like a copy of the actual Windows disk and a few bits of software. What's also important is that, in fact, if you've got that situation where you've got this recovery drive and maybe another small drive, they are all sitting on one physical disk. So one of the things that can make things a little bit confusing is that you can have a single physical disk with a number of different drives. I'll come back to that. If you have a desktop, you can add physical disks, new disks, which is what I've done. So all of these are actually different disks. So this D is actually another solid state disk, and that's just under 500 gigabytes in size. So basically it means I can do things with speed using these two. E and F are both separate physical disks, and they're kind of normal disks, but you can see they're big. They're 3.6, they're nearly 4 terabytes. So that's nearly 4,000 gigabytes each. And you can see that I've used a fair amount of space on both of them. So if you have multiple disks, not just drives, but disks, then there is some value in moving the data onto one of these other disks. And you can see that for me, all of these go to the E drive. Let me remind you here, the E drive is one of my physically separate disks. Why do I do that? Well, because by default, obviously, these will all go to the C drive, somewhere on the C drive, probably in your user area. Now the C drive is busy. The C drive is the one that usually gets chocker, especially when you start something, start a program, start the computer. And things can happen all the time on the C drive. So the more you do on the C drive, the more you can slow things up and the performance can be poorer. So by moving them onto a separate physical drive, like my E drive, I just free the whole process up. It means that I get a little bit of extra performance out of my setup. Now do be careful, you can also do what's called partitioning. So if you have a big, suppose you actually say, well, I don't need 250 gigabytes of C drive. I could split that into two drives, each of 120 gigabytes more or less. So I would have a C drive, and maybe here I'd have an X drive, I don't know, call it what you will. Well, I've got an X drive down there, Y drive. Now that means they're separate drives, and there is some value in sending your files to the other half of the disk, of the Y drive that I've just created in my head. But it's still going to the same physical disk, so you're still impacting the same disk that's doing all the work on the C drive, even though you're notionally sending it to a Y drive. Okay. There's value for you, perhaps, because you're saving everything, and in particular your default file location, so the documents you save automatically are going to a separate space, a space that you can find quite easily, and you're keeping it out of the area where you've got all your installations and your default stuff and your system stuff. So there is a little bit of value in doing that, but it's not going to give you much performance value. Whereas if you've got separate drives, you're going to get some performance value as well. Now it does have to be said, you'll notice that I've also got these drives, and you may have these drives visible if you looked in the same place. And these tell you that, in fact, you probably don't unless you've got a USB stick actually stuck in one of your USB ports. These are here permanently because I've got something else that I've added to my computer that means that they're always finding these drives even when they're not being used, and they're not currently being used. If I tried to access these, I would get an error. But it does mean that you can save to a USB drive. Now, if you have a laptop and you only have a C drive, or this C drive plus this D drive that's a recovery disk, you could actually buy yourself a USB drive. Let's say you spend out a bit and you get a USB drive, one of these memory sticks with 128 gigabytes free. You could stick it in one of your USB ports and leave it there, so it's there permanently. You could treat that like a second drive. Now it would be a little bit slower. These USB drives are not as fast as internal drives, but nevertheless you would be keeping it separate, and the advantage of that, of course, is that if your computer dies, then you still have your data. And in fact, I haven't mentioned that, but with this idea of separating, with mine on my E drive, it's not only going to mean there's a performance benefit, but it also means I'm keeping my data off the system drive. So if everything goes AWOL, if my system just totally dies, and it's because the C drive has died, my data, my files, my documents, and my Excel spreadsheets are safe, because they're on the E drive. Obviously, if the E drive becomes corrupted, then you've still got a problem. So you still need to do your backups. You still need to copy them somewhere else. Okay, so this is the whole thinking behind giving you the option to change where you put your files. So if you are working on a laptop and you have no real chance of adding extra internal drives, you basically only have two options. You can either stick a USB drive in one of your, a memory stick in one of your USB drives, keep it there and change all of these to your USB drive, or you can simply accept that you can't really make any changes and you might as well leave them as they are. You can still change the location if you choose to, but you need to know what you're doing if you're going to do that. And a word of warning, if you decide that you're going to have a USB memory stick that you're going to use as a kind of second drive, you really need to make sure that it's left in all the time, because obviously if you take it out and you start using Excel, you will get errors, or at least Excel simply won't know what to do. If you have a desktop PC, and there are a very small number of laptops where you might have this capability as well, you do have the ability to add physical disks inside your machine. And it is worth thinking about doing that. If you have a desktop, you can even mirror those disks. Now that's a whole different ballgame. If you don't know about disk mirroring, don't worry. But it is a way of giving you extra resilience and potentially protecting your data as well. But the important thing is you could add another disk and you could actually direct all your saves and all the other bits and pieces to that disk. So that's what these are about. I think that's enough on that topic. But just bear in mind that that's what these areas are about. So in terms of auto recovery file location, if you have got a separate disk somewhere, change to it, create a folder that's suitable. You'll notice I've got one that's MS Auto Recover Excel, I've got another one for MS Auto Recover Word, and another one for PowerPoint. Okay. The next option here is don't show the backstage when opening or saving files with keyboard shortcuts. Now this needs a little bit of explanation. So let's come out of here. Let me create something and let me go as if I'm going to save it. Okay, so notice I've got a quick thing up here, or I can go to File and Save. And notice that I get this area, which is what you see when you actually start Excel, probably. So it gives me kind of fundamental choices. I can look on this PC, I can, and that will look for stuff that is used in the past. I can do a browse, which will open up my folder, I'll show you in a minute. Or in fact, I can save stuff on OneDrive as I've got it set up at the moment. Yours may look slightly different, especially if you're using a business machine rather than your personal machine. And then here are simply locations that I've used recently, and there's quite a few of them, and this can be very useful. It works on the idea that, you know, you tend to use what you've used recently. And if that works for you, then in a sense there's no changes needed. If this gives you most of the stuff that you need, then that's what you need. But if you can't use this, if you're looking around, if you tend to save things in different places almost every time, you will need to click on the Browse, and the Browse will open the standard Windows sort of folder mechanism, which allows you to navigate the whole of your PC. Okay, now the question is, suppose you don't want to do this, you want to go straight to Browse. You always browse, you always end up going into Browse. Okay, well, what I didn't tell you is that this is called the backstage. Don't know why it's called the backstage, but that's what it is. So if you don't want that, you can go into the settings. So here we are, we're in Save, and I can select Don't Show the Backstage when opening or saving files with keyboard shortcuts. Okay, so I OK that. And now if I go to Save, it goes straight to my browser. So I don't get that backstage. So again, whether you want to activate that option or not depends on how you use Excel. I'm not going to change it, so I'm going to go back there and I'm going to deselect that so that I do still show the backstage when I open it. It's down to you. Notice the next option is to show additional places for saving, even if sign-in may be required. Okay. Now, I found on my personal computer that changing this makes absolutely no difference. It's all about these, on the backstage, it's all about these different places here. Okay. Now, I think this becomes relevant if you're working on a machine that's part of a network. And basically, it allows you to show network. You can either exclude or include network things as well. I'm not sure about that. Didn't work in my setup, and therefore I have basically ignored it. Okay. The same is true of the next option. So I'm not really going to talk about this show additional places for saving, even if sign-in may be required. Remember, this is for networking capability effectively, and it wasn't available. It isn't available on my machine because my machine is basically standalone. And in fact, I found that when I tried to activate Save to Computer by default, nothing happened either. And again, I think it's all to do with networked computers. So these two I'm ignoring. If you think that you may have a setup where it may apply, then you need to experiment with it and try it. And basically, it's just deselect that one or select that one, see if it makes a difference in the way you save. Just try and save a document, see if it makes a difference. We then get to come back to a couple more locations. We basically talked about these. The default local file location is basically where you will start up when you do that save. And if you tend to put all your files in one location, then that will be it. I use this as a base, and then I actually have folders that sit on top of that. So it takes me through to the point where I can select what I want to select fairly easily. Default personal template locations probably are of no or very little value to you. But if you play around with different templates on your Excel spreadsheets, then it may be that you want to set it up for a location that's easy for you to find. And then the last one is show data loss warning when editing comma deleted files. This is a little bit esoteric. In fact, if you save a file in CSV format, then you will get that warning anyway. So I think there's very little value in this, but it does mean that it's warning you when you're working in CSV context. And if you do that a lot and you've actually lost data because you've forgotten that you're in CSV, you may want to select that. You then get these auto recover exceptions for book 1. Now, it's book 1 is here because that's what my spreadsheet is called. If I change my name, it would change this one. And notice that in theory it gives me a choice. That might be because I've got several books open. But this is basically saying your current sheet. Now, it seems quite hard work to be changing settings for a specific workbook or spreadsheet. But you may find that useful. And this disables auto recovery, so it's basically what we talked about up here. So it's like clicking that option here, save auto recovery information, but specifically and only for this particular workbook. That might have more value. especially if you sort of look at it and you say, well, you know, this is information I can recover easily. It's stopping every 10 minutes to 10 minutes. I've got a poorly performing computer, and yet I don't need to save this data anyway. I'm really just looking at it for information. Well, you can disable auto recovery for that workbook specifically. So it's worth knowing about that. The rest of the stuff down here is a little bit more esoteric and a little bit more difficult to go into in detail. The offline editing options, again, this is really for people who are working on the network. I guess with Office 360, 360 or 365, never remember. This might be more useful because you are working from the cloud and you could well be working cooperatively. But in whatever version, if you're working cooperatively, you have to book out your spreadsheet perhaps. Then this becomes more useful. And where you save the draft location is also quite important. Now you can see this one's going into a PowerPoint thing. Why on earth I put it there, I don't know. But for most uses, for use on the personal computer, this really is of little value. And then finally, playing around with the appearance of the workbook, you'll see that there's a little explanation there that you can read. This is, notice it says choose what colors will be seen in previous versions of Excel. This is actually quite confusing, and I played with this quite a bit. So if you go in here, basically you can select a color. So these are presumably kind of standard colors. So if I selected red and I select modify and I change it to yellow, I'm not going to, but suppose I change it to yellow, you will find, well, in fact, if I click on it, you'll see you've got the current color is red and the new color is yellow. Now I can only presume that if you do that, then if you have something that's red in your earlier spreadsheet, something that was created in a different version of Excel, it will change it to yellow in your current ones. I really don't understand the benefit of this. I guess, I don't know if you've done this, but if you do load in an old Excel spreadsheet, you will get a message telling you that it's an old one and it's doing some changes, and it may not be exactly the same as it was originally. So I guess if it's very important that you've got a presentation from this old one that you need to have in a new version, you may need to experiment, and using this you may discover that there are certain colors that don't work properly, and you can make them work properly by changing the colors. And I can only assume that's what this is about. And then once you've changed those in this permanent way, you can load in kind of a whole load of these old ones and they should work better. But once again, this is me kind of assuming this. For most people, it's irrelevant. So those are the save options. Apart from the one or two that are very arcane, it's pretty straightforward. And there's probably not a lot for you to do other than playing around with changing locations if you have got additional disk locations. If I look at some of the other options, language is worth you looking at if you do use stuff from different languages. You'll see that I've got French and Italian down here. I thought I had Spanish as well, but I haven't. Now it is actually telling me that I have already implemented French, so proofing is installed. So I could have French stuff in my spreadsheet and it would function with those just as readily as it functions with the English. I've obviously told it that I use Italian, but I haven't actually activated it. So it's telling me that proofing is available, but that implies it's not installed. And if I click on proofing available, it would install the proofing stuff for Italian. You can add a language, and that will basically add a language in Windows, but certainly for the whole of Office. There's a lot more that I could talk about with languages. You can see it also will install additional keyboards. A lot of this is about Windows settings rather than just Office. But I don't want to talk about too much of that. I'm not really focusing on working with Excel in other languages. That's something perhaps you need to look into if that's of value to you. It's worth emphasizing, though, that the language capability is there, and if you do work in different languages, it's worth you spending a bit more effort finding out about that and seeing if you can add benefit to your Excel spreadsheets. We've also got this ease of access option, and this is really if you have some kind of access problem, if you have a disability of one sort or another that makes access more difficult, then there are options here. And I think this is pretty straightforward. Part of this is if you don't have an access problem, but you are likely to have other people accessing your spreadsheets that do, then in fact you can tick this Keep Accessibility Checker running while you work. You can create sound feedback, and you can actually change what they sound like, and in fact you can continue to provide feedback with animation. You can change the way you display screen tips, including getting rid of screen tips. I'm suggesting that you leave those as they are. We've looked at those to some extent in the general setting as well. It's the same sort of idea as we had for those menu options. You can limit where screen tips show, and in fact you can increase the font size. Now my guess, that for me, because I don't have a physical disability, other than kind of getting a bit harder to see things as I get older, most of this doesn't mean a lot to me, and I'm not a good person to be talking about this. And again, if either you have a physical disability or you have concerns that what you work on should be made more accessible to people with a physical disability, then it's worth you spending a little bit more time on this. And again, I would do a Google search, and there will be books that will explain a bit more how to use this. It's very difficult to talk about this in abstract, because what you activate and don't activate will depend perhaps on the specific disability or disabilities that you're targeting. Font size I find easy to understand because I sometimes have to increase the font size. So I'm already in the category where this might be a useful thing to activate. So in a way, I apologize. I'm kind of pleading ignorance on this area. But it is, again, something like languages. If it's of concern or interest to you, it's worth you exploring this a little more. Of all the very general options, we only have one more, which is the advanced, and you can see this is quite a busy one. There's quite a lot here. So I will deal with this on yet another video. So for now, I hope that was helpful.